Hi everyone, welcome back. Gosh, what a strange week it has been. So last Wednesday came home and they announced they're going to close the schools, and this Wednesday I'm sitting here and schools are in shutdown, I suppose, but kind of open, and the country is in a semi-lockdown. How odd. Anyway, I hope everybody's doing really well. It's such a strange set of circumstances. I think teachers are naturally quite social creatures. We have to be. We're locked away with a group of students all day, every day. And it must be incredibly difficult for some staff who perhaps don't have family at home to be on their own, not necessarily knowing what to do with themselves. So I hope your schools are taking good care of you. And if they're not, shout about it, because you need to. While I was sitting looking through my Facebook feed earlier today, I spotted a question that somebody had asked, and it wasn't within one of my groups, it was in another SENCO group, so I do apologise for picking that question up from that group, but I thought it was quite an interesting question that they asked, and I'm going to read it. They said, "As I seem to have a bit more time on my hands than originally expected, working from home, can you suggest any must-have resources, paperwork or systems in place that I can develop over this period to support staff, pupils or parents for a head start in the next academic year?" I know that's fairly vague, but any SENCO must-haves. Now, first of all, I read it and I thought, "Oh, you lucky bleep." Because some SENCOs I've been talking to are absolutely run off their feet with things that they're being asked to do to support their most vulnerable learners. For some reason, apparently SEN has now fallen entirely to the SENCO and not to the other staff available in schools. Pretty sure the Code of Practice says that all staff are responsible, but then again, everything seems to have gone out of the window at the moment, so let's just make the SENCO do it. Whereas in other schools, it seems to have been fairly distributed, or even to the point of, well, actually the SEN kids all just have to get on with it like everybody else. I'm not going to comment on that at all at this point in time. However, to answer the question that the person posed on Facebook, I think this is a really interesting scenario. We've got a bit of time, theoretically, and we have got that opportunity to do some of those things that sometimes we would love to have the chance to set up. And I was planning to do a time management video at some point. And as I sat writing my script for this, it's not a script, it's a scrap of paper, but as I sat writing my script for this video, I realised that most of the bullet points that I've put on here are actually what I would have included in my time management video. Now, if you don't have my book, The SENDCO, then you won't have heard any of this before. If you do have my book, have a look in there on my chapter about time management and the SENCO year, because some of these suggestions do actually come from that chapter. Anyway, let's have a think about some of the things that this SENCO could be doing. First of all, my suggestion is to make a calendar for the year. So to list out all the things that she does over the course of a year and try to plot them out. Has she got any pinch points? Now, I don't know whether she's a primary SENCO or a secondary SENCO. I do know it's a she, going by the name and the picture at the side though, so I think it's okay to use she. Anyway, but I don't know whether she's primary or secondary, or even if she's early years or FE. So there will be different pinch points for people at different stages here. For me, my nightmare times were September, when I was trying to do transition for my year 7s and making sure they were settled, and my year 11s, or 10s and 11s, as they were starting to take their GCSE courses and kind of, I haven't chosen the right thing. I had a bit of a high level of work around about January, February time, as we were rushing to get through exam applications. So staff who hadn't given me the information, but we were trying to get everything through so we could get those concessions in place for them based on the January mock exams. And then again, I had a bit of a flurry of activity around about June, July time as we're working with the year sixes and the year fives, trying to get our transition information in place so we can have that smooth transfer in the September. And it always used to irritate me how my colleagues would get GCSE time downtime because the students had disappeared off their radar. I didn't teach GCSE year groups because they felt I shouldn't have the pressure of teaching GCSE year groups, but that of course meant my timetable didn't actually drop off in the summer term, and yet I ended up with more work because we were having to do all the transition stuff. But being able to plot out a calendar of when things were due was really, really helpful. My local authority also had certain times in the year when you can apply for additional needs funding. So we actually only had 2 points in the year when you could do it. October, and then there was an emergency panel in the April. It's actually changed now since I left them. They now do it 3 times a year with a couple of emergency panels, but that again is by the by. I had a fixed time in which I could do that. So a child coming to me in September who I felt I might need funding for, I actually had to gather my evidence and write that evidence document before the October, submit it, and then wait for the panel. And I was actually on the panel, so I used to have to go and attend that as well and fit the time in. So for me, I had different times during the year for doing different things, and I'm sure that that's the same for every SENCO because it's been the same for me in every school I've worked in. So I know that everywhere you go you've got different things and they happen at different times, and it's just really important to get those down and work out how can I divvy this up. You know, can I actually do all those things in that month, or do I actually need to say to the head teacher, look, you know, February is a nightmare. I might as well write February off. I've got 7 annual reviews due and you need me to do my exam concessions and I've got this going on and that going on. Can you just cover me for the whole of February? But I'll work in January or something. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but you'd be able to see it if you plotted it out. The second suggestion I had was to seriously look at what it is we do as SENCOs, and try to create things that help us to save time. So, is there something that other people could do for you, but that you at the moment do because you're thinking, oh, it's going to take me so long to train them to do it? Whereas actually you've got that opportunity at the moment to train somebody to do something, to let them make a mistake, and for you to have the time to correct that mistake and retrain them on it. So a real chance there to kind of get that staff training out there, to develop your staff, to move them onwards as well, but also to delegate some of the work so that you have got more time to do other things. Of course, I have to remind you that you can't delegate your accountability as a SENCO. You can only delegate the task. How does staff, the third point, how does staff signal that a child has a special educational need or might have a special educational need? I know a lot of schools have moved away from paperwork. That's absolutely fine. If that's what you've done, design a Google form or a Microsoft form where they can fill it in with what they've already done to try and support the child, where the difficulties are manifesting. Put some check boxes on there of things that you'd like them to look for when reporting to you, or things that you want them to have tried before reporting to you, and how long they've tried them for, so that you've got that real body of evidence before you're actually going in to go and explore whether that child does have any special educational needs, or whether it's just the teaching that isn't quite right. My fourth suggestion was around the letters that we send throughout the year. I'm a big fan of Word and mail merge. I like it. I worked out how to use it many, many years ago, and I've never really looked back, to be fair. So I used to create my letters pro forma, like a template if you like, and then I would just put the data into the database that sits behind it, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet. So the name of the pupil or the name of the parent who it got to go to, what the bit of information was I needed to add that was different on each one, and then just hit the print button. So I didn't need to type out a letter each time I wanted to create something. I could simply put the additional bits of information into a document and then just hit the print button. Now, if you don't feel quite as tech savvy as that, you could still create a Word document with the main body of information in it, but with some gaps. And then when it comes to those typical letters that we have to send, so perhaps we want the paediatrician to look at a child because we'd like them to explore possible dyspraxia. So we know that we're going to be addressing it with the child's name and address at the top and their information, their date of birth. We know that we're going to be putting what year group they're in. We know we're going to be telling the paediatrician what our concern is. We know that we're going to then go into a bit of personal detail about the child. That's the different bit. And then we're going to be saying exactly what we want at the bottom, what we'd like to achieve from that letter. Well, that can all be designed in advance, and then all I have to do is pop my different bits perhaps onto a post-it note and give that to my admin if I have admin, or give it to a TA, or give it to we used to use my receptionist at the school, was very good at typing things for me. I could give her a post-it note and say, can you fill the gaps in on this for me, and I'd send her a blank copy or a template of that document, and she'd just go down and fill them in and send it to me. I sign it, we post it off. But that used to save me an incredible amount of time. I didn't have to keep thinking, oh, how do I start this letter, or what do I need to include in this one? It was all there ready, but I'd had the chance to modify them, look at them. Does this one work? Doesn't it work? What's going to work best for me? And have that bank of letters ready made. And I think that this person here who is saying they've got a bit of spare time on their hands, well, actually, that would be a pretty good use of their time, is to get that bank of everyday stuff ready made. Linked to that one would also be some checklists for staff. So very often we see passports being written for children that say, oh, they've got dyslexia, and then what we know happens is that they copy and paste half a dozen statements from one document onto the passport to say, child's got dyslexia, do this. Well, actually, why don't you just create the checklists in the first place? Now, I know there's a lady on Facebook, and she advertises her school each time because they've got bookmarks. So they've designed a dyslexia bookmark, an ASC bookmark, and one for dyspraxia and one for dyscalculia, and that kind of thing. They've already thought about it. They've got those in place, and they can give a copy to a child, give a copy to a parent. They could give copies to staff and put them on a key ring or something. Again, I think it's a really good use of time. And it goes back to that, the teacher taking responsibility. I've got a class of students, they're struggling with something. If I've given them a checklist of what are they actually struggling with, is it the size of the font, is it the style of the font, can they read it if you've read it to them first? Do they follow your finger as you're tracking across the line, or will they go away with the fairies somewhere? Giving them that kind of checklist lets them hone in on different things. Now, I'm not saying a checklist is going to diagnose a child. That is something I am absolutely against. I don't agree with it at all. But I think giving people an idea of things they can look for is a really useful tool. I also suggested a bit of simple CPD. So again, we can give staff a list of strategies to use with our SEN pupils, or things that we want them to look for when they're trying to identify what the difficulty might be. But we don't always explain why the child has that difficulty. Let's take our child with ADHD. And let's be rather stereotypical for a moment. They can't sit still, they're flitting around, they're volatile, they're throwing things, they're out of their seat, they're annoying, they're shouting over you, they might be swearing, and they don't get the work done, and it's messy when they do. But does the member of staff understand why they behave that way? Because sometimes it's really easy to go, well, they've got ADHD, makes them naughty, that's what they're doing. But actually, if they understood the neurological background to that, or they had a little bit of an inkling behind that, then actually they treat it differently. And I think it's this danger of giving somebody a label, isn't it? So you've got dyslexia, it means you can't read and spell. That isn't true. So if we can explain to staff what dyslexia actually means, or what ADHD actually means, or what dyspraxia or any of the others actually mean, it just gives them that bit of extra to be able to support that child and to understand that child, and hopefully not stereotype that child like I just did in the example. The next thing they could do, so number 7 on my list here, is to have a look at the SEN information that they've got on their own website. Perhaps they could create an SEN handbook for any new staff, or even for themselves. There is a danger that we run out of time throughout the year and we've created a policy, let's say. Not that that's statutory, but let's just call it an SEN policy for a moment. And we created it 3 years ago, just after the SEN Code of Practice came out. And our head teacher came up to us in February when it was really, really busy and said, "Can you update the policy?" And you went, "Oh, yeah, sure." So you had a quick scan through it and you went, "Yeah, we still do all that." Signed it, changed the date. And the following year, the head teacher said, "Oh my goodness, it's February again. I need you to do the policy." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And you scan down it and change the date. And don't actually think, do I still do everything I'm saying I'm doing on this policy? There's a real danger of that in a lot of things within schools, because we don't want to go back to the beginning and start things from scratch. And why should we? However, it's really important that what we're putting out there to our parents is correct, and the information that we're giving to everybody else is correct. So this is an opportunity to go through that kind of thing and just double check and make sure that, is this really us? Is this giving the right message about our school and what we do and our values? The 8th thing on my list, and I promise there's only 12, but the 8th thing on my list is to start thinking about return. Now at the moment we don't know whether that's going to be the 20th of April, the week after Easter, or whether it's going to be the 20th of May, or the 20th of June, or could even be September. We don't know the answer to that at this point in time. And for some of our students and staff and us, that's quite discombobulating. I don't think I've ever said that word out loud before. I have now. It's very unnerving not knowing when. I'm somebody who likes to be in control. I like to know when and where and what is going to happen. And not knowing those things is makes me quite nervous. For some of our students and for some of our staff, multiply that by a couple of 100,000 and think about how they're feeling. Even though we don't know when, we know that we are going to go back to an education system of some description at some point. And for that, we are going to need to start putting things in place. So, could we think about how we transition those children back into school? And I'll admit right now, I haven't thought about it. I haven't, sat down for a couple of hours and thought about how I would put a transition module in place. I'm only answering this question here of what could I do with my time. And I think that's something that I might use that time for, to think about how I can graduate my children back in. And if they're going back to their same teacher, that makes my life a bit easier. If they're going to be moving into an entirely different year group, that makes it a bit harder. If they're going to be moving out of my school into the one down the road, oh my goodness, that is massive, because they haven't finished, they haven't had the chance to end everything in their previous establishment before going to the next one. The 9th thing on my list is provisions and plans and things like that. So having a look at your provisions and what you normally put in place in school, and do they actually work? Are there any alternatives? And can you explore those alternatives whilst we are not in schools? At the moment, a lot of companies are offering their resources and their products, especially the online services, for free. That will eventually become a paid service for a lot of those products, but at the moment they're free. So if you wanted to explore something that you've not actually tried before, you have that opportunity at the moment to go out and go, actually, you know what, I need a license for that. And you can give it to a couple of students and let them have a go with it and get them to give you the feedback about whether it's any good. The national curriculum has been scrapped. Some schools are sending work home for children, some schools aren't. Some children are doing it and their parents are supporting them, some aren't. So if you have the chance to get a hold of some new resources, to trial them with some students and find out whether or not they work for you, that would give you the chance to revamp your provisions and interventions for the following year. And I think now is a nice time to actually do that. I always make a joke about Toe by Toe. If you don't know Toe by Toe, it's that wonderful red book where we teach children phonics back from the beginning again. So regardless of what level they're actually at, you start at the beginning of the book and you work your way through it. And it's very much like precision teaching, so that they have to get it right so many times in a row before they move on to the next part. And I don't have anything against Toe by Toe, but I have seen so many times where we think a child has dyslexic difficulties and the answer is, get a copy of Toe by Toe. And they give that to the child. And it's one of those fallback things. I can guarantee that one of my schools, if I ever saw dyslexia or a low reading age on a plan that came up to me, I could guarantee that when I got them in the September, they would come up with their little red book, so many pages completed in it, because that was their natural response to that kind of difficulty. It may be right for some children, but it isn't right for every child. So have a look at your provisions. Can you review them? Can you work out what works for you, what doesn't work for you? And if you need to refresh them, what could you put in place instead? My 10th thing on the list was to, very, very similar, look at assessments. So what do you currently use to assess speech and language in your school? Or what do you currently use to get a reading gauge or a spelling gauge? How do you know the social and emotional skills of your students? Do you actually use them? And is it in date? So a lot of things have been updated over the last probably 5 or 6 years or so. So I have RAT 4. I haven't bought RAT 5. RAT 5 has come out. RAT 4 is still valid because you can buy blank test papers for it. As soon as you can't buy blank test papers for that from a reputable site, then that test becomes invalid and you must move to RAT 5. That's the general rule. I won't be replacing mine unless I go back full-time into a school, or I decide to go full-time into assessment. That's not going to happen. Staying on top of those, I remember inheriting a cupboard, rather than the filing cabinet this time, but I inherited a cupboard with the Ravens matrices in there. So anybody who's been around as long as me will know what the Ravens matrices are. And I was so excited that I'd found these Ravens matrices because they were so expensive to buy, until I flicked open the book and realised it was written in 1956. And it probably wasn't standardised on a modern population. Number 11. What don't you know? So, if I'd got spare time on my hands, I would go and explore an area of SEN that I perhaps don't have as much knowledge about. Maybe it's auditory processing disorder, or maybe it's sensory processing difficulties, maybe it's dyscalculia, I don't know, whatever it is that's I'm struggling with this. I would go and I would explore that topic in detail to really get to grips with it. Or maybe I know I've got a student in school who is coming to my school, perhaps because we know who our September intake are now. Maybe I know I've got a child coming in September who has Down syndrome. And maybe I've never worked with a child who has Down syndrome before. Maybe I don't know what to expect. Perhaps I could do some work there around building up my knowledge so that I can then share that with the rest of the staff in school and support them to support that child when they arrive. And my 12th one on there is to look at your plans and your provisions that you've got in place in school, and if you do have them, to make sure that they're reviewed. So as you know, I do work for Educare and their learning plans and provision maps, and one of the things I've been talking to customers about this week is to say, you know what, you either need to review everything you've got in place, or you need to turn off the review button and just archive it all. Because if we're not going to go back until September, you're not going to do those provisions from March to July, so we might as well close it off now and start again in September. So all those things, getting them up to date, making sure they're in place, but still making sure we've got a record of what we have done at some point with our students. I think it's quite important to use some of that time to build up parental relationships. So perhaps getting in contact with your parents, finding out about those variations of behaviour, the differences between school and home. Are they behaving differently with their parents at home now to what you have experienced in school? And I think you get a better feel of that now that parents are experiencing schooling their child. Ask them how it's going, check on them, and ask them if there's anything you can do to help. You can't make any promises, but we know that subject teachers, especially in secondary, don't always necessarily put out things that cater to everybody's needs. So asking if there's anything you can do there to support, and pointing them in the direction of support that is available to them. I also think that if I was a Year 7 SENCO, I'd be getting hold of the Year 6 SENCO and saying, hey look, I've got your kids coming up next year. Is there any chance you can pass my details on to those parents so that they can contact me and I can start building those relationships now? Because that's going to actually be quite important in terms of what's happening. Now, to be fair, we don't know what's happening. We don't know whether children are going to go back into their own schools, in which case we can possibly get some transition going, or whether they're actually just going to move straight up to their next year group, or whether we're even going to move the school year and perhaps have children go back until, I don't know, October half term in their current year group and then move to October. Which actually I don't think is a bad idea, but that's just me. Anyway, building those relationships is probably just one of those really key things that we need to do. I just want to finish by saying that if you have got time as a SENCO, perhaps imagining it as you're walking into the role. Your first day on the job. What would you have liked to be handed to you in your hand on a platter? Whatever the phrases you want to use. What's all that information you wish somebody could have just picked up off the shelf and gone, here you go, this is SEN in a nutshell for you in our school. And if you could create something like that over this period of time, I think that would be a job well done. Back to the person that asked the question on Facebook. She said she's got time on her hands. What can she do? Hopefully I've given you plenty of ideas there of things that you could consider. Take care, guys.